All right, thank you for staying with the Monday Report. We're starting the discussion right now. My guest already with me in studio is talking about the state of human rights, and I'll start from my immediate right. Irungu Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya. Thank you for making time.
Good evening.
Next is Neema Mutemi, Positive Youth Development Expert. Thank you for making time.
Good evening.
And Joshua Nyamori, Advocate of the High Court. Thank you for making time.
Good evening.
And Irungu, I'll start with you. What is your assessment of the state of human rights? We've seen complaints, right, from the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, Mary Lawler, saying that her letters have been ignored. And especially this was in regards to the protests and the human rights abuses at that time. We know Njagi and Oyo are still missing to date. Uganda says they don't have them. Kenya seems to be a bit silent on that. What is the state of human rights in your assessment?
No, I think it's highly regrettable that the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights Defenders issued that statement, but it was somewhat expected in many ways. I think June and July were probably the most violent months we've seen in a few years. The attacks on protesters were very directed, and there was a tremendous amount of excessive use of force. We lost 47 people, I think, in about 6 hours on Sabasaba Day. We also saw the increasing use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act against protesters, and many people found themselves essentially incarcerated, detained for long periods of time without bail terms that they could even raise. This morning, the Law Society 50 plus million campaign plus Amnesty International were at Makadara, and we were successful in our attempt to bring down the bail terms for 7 persons who had been arrested on Sabasaba Day, and they had initially been charged and given bail terms of 100,000, and they have been 5 out of the 7 who didn't have NGOs to pay for their bail terms have actually been in detention essentially for 103 days because they couldn't raise the bail terms. So I think Mary Lawler's commentary really should be a wake-up call for the government. I don't know if people are listening, and I don't know whether there'll be a response to the case, but obviously what's going to happen next is it will be referred to the UN Human Rights Council, and there, unfortunately, Kenya will find itself as a member of the council also being a subject of the council, and that is deeply regrettable.
Irungu, have you heard anything from Oyo and Njagi? Because the statement earlier on today seemed to speak to the fact that they are not in good health, as if there's someone in touch with them, because the government of Uganda says they don't have them. They don't know where they are. The government of Kenya doesn't say anything. This statement alluded to seemingly some conversation. Have you heard anything from them?
Yes, I was part of the press conference with Vocal Africa and Law Society this afternoon, and we deliberately chose to escalate the sense of urgency around their case. It's been 26 days since they were picked in broad daylight by people who wore uniforms. The eyewitness accounts suggest that they were people in police and armed uniforms, so therefore they were not picked by strangers. They were picked by state operatives of the Ugandan government, and attempts to file a habeas corpus have essentially brought no relief to their families. So therefore we are very concerned. Informally, we have heard from people who have a bit more information from within Kampala that they're in very bad shape, and that the concerns of torture, concerns of intimidation, and also just the general lack of access to them is a matter of major concern. I think the words that were used by Vocal Africa Director Hussein Khalid, I think, were very important for me. He talked about, at this stage, the Kenyan government must demand for a proof of life. But unfortunately, in the last 2 weeks, we've seen very little action publicly, and we have seen no public statement by the government of Kenya. It is almost like they have just been released to the Ugandan government to do what they may be. And I think that is a tremendous shame for this country, given that we have a foreign policy that is based on the principle of national sovereignty. I can't believe 2 Kenyans could be held for so long, and there is not an uproar anyway. I just want to if I can just do this, I just want to hold up a banner that we have put out there. This QR code, if we can zoom in on the QR code, it takes you to a place where you can write a letter calling for the release of Bob Njagi and also Nick. So I'm just asking Kenyans to please continue their emails and their concerns, because we have to bring them home.
Okay. Nema, what do we seem to be getting wrong as a country as you give your assessment of human rights? Because the reason why I ask that question is, in as much as the bail terms were reviewed for the young people incarcerated for alleged protest and destruction of property, the destruction of property did happen, except now we are arguing that those in custody are not the ones who did it. So how then, where do you draw the line? How do you know then who did it? And what do we keep getting wrong as a country when it comes to dealing with human rights?
Okay, that's a tough one, and it's a layered question, Trevor. So I want to begin with, from the definition of, we can't talk about human rights without looking at what kind of country we have. Are we, by definition, a democracy? Do we believe in neoliberal rights? Do we believe in civil liberties? Because if we can't, as Kenyans, say without question what kind of state we live in, what kind of country, we've agreed to be living in, and what kind of governance system that we have, then that question ceases to apply. This question is not, the state of human rights doesn't apply if you're living in a non-dictatorial state, if you're living in in a caliphate, or whatever other systems there are. So we need to start challenging ourselves in terms of, have we signed up for whatever is going on right now? So let's go back to civil liberties. Freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of political association, freedom of worship. These are not basic human rights. They're not basic rights that are guaranteed under the Declaration of Human Rights, but they are civil liberties that Kenya, since 1972, has ascribed to. Every Kenyan has the right to associate with whoever they want to participate politically, be it in Kenya or in Uganda or in Tanzania, where they feel like they're East African citizens. They all are guaranteed those rights. No one has a right to kidnap them. No one has a right to remove them from one of those countries where they are legally to any other country, including returning them to Kenya without their consent or illegally. So the reason we fight for these liberties is because the description of the country we think we've subscribed to by birth and those who naturalize is because Kenya has already signed up for this. When you look at now the issue of terrorism, when talking about civil liberties again, there are demarcations. So even when you are dealing in matters of national security or protecting the state from individuals you believe to be dangerous, like in the case of terrorism and terrorist acts, which is one of the most serious charges you can face in this country, the state, as a neoliberal democracy, has certain boundaries within which it should operate to keep Kenyans safe from those individuals. So even when you're dealing with known terrorists, you need to balance the tactics of security with the assurances of keeping Kenyans safe and safeguarding their liberties. Okay. So we are not saying that do not prosecute people who have banned shops. We are not saying, do not prosecute people who clobbered people in the streets, because we do know that those things happen. What we are saying is you need to ensure that every Kenyan is prosecuted in line with the rule of law, and we actually just want proof that the state is not violating people's rights in the name of cracking down on crime. Because let's just call it a crime.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nyamori, is there an overreach by the state, so to speak? Are they missing the mark here by being overbearing on people?
Definitely, there have been certain aspects of overreach. We have had cases in which, people have died in custody, and, there have been excessive use of force. But I think, as Nema is mentioning, there is also the element that we as a citizenry, we have to get to the point in which we exercise our rights, but we also protect the state. The rights will never exist without the state, and I think this is a narrative, and these are issues that Kenyans should discuss about. That we need to have space to exercise our civil liberties, but we also ensure that we exercise them in a manner that would protect the state, to ensure we have Kenya tomorrow. We also appreciate that we need to build systems, and we need to, transform the security agencies. It takes more than just, throwing words at them and expecting that they would be changed. I always give the example that one day when I was still a young activist, I went to the PPO's office in Kisumu to protest about human rights abuses by the security forces. And then, then PPO Kaindi, she later became the DIG, told me is that, Nyamori, unfortunately, what you are saying is the right thing that needs to be done. But what we are doing is what we are trained at Kiganjo. Okay, so what that means is that we need to change the entire philosophy of policing. We need to change the curriculum. We need to humanize the policemen and the policewomen. We need to support them, to give them the necessary equipment to do crowd controls. And then we need to build relationship between, the security agencies and the people. But even as we do this, we need to ensure that we maintain high standards with regard to maintenance of human rights and accountability matters.
And Irungu, you mentioned that you're surprised that there's not an uproar now, and it's 26 days since Njagi and Oyo were missing. Are the people themselves accomplices to this? Because it's true what you're saying. We haven't seen much of a conversation from the Kenyans themselves, despite 2 of their own citizens missing.
No, I wouldn't say they were complicit. I think partly to say that would be somehow to allege that Kenyans, 56 million Kenyans conspired to kidnap Bob and Nick off the streets of Kampala. No, I don't think that's the case. What I do think is that Kenyans are increasingly becoming very weary, in the sense of being tired of the number of human rights violations that we're seeing on a daily basis. I've often said that if you're paying attention in Kenya today, there has to be a level of trauma that you have to manage on a daily basis in order to continue to be optimistic, to continue to be engaged, and to believe that tomorrow can be a better day. Just to give an example, we talked a little bit, Joshua talked a little bit about, the cases of, police custody cases. There have been 18 police deaths, rather deaths in police custody in the last one year. Just in this year alone. If we go back to the funeral of the late Raila Odinga, we saw 6 human beings essentially killed, and tens of people tear gassed and beaten. I think over 65 people had to be treated for injuries during the 2 Kasarani and Nyayo events. Why were police using live bullets at that time? So I think there is a sense in which people are getting increasingly exhausted, and therefore it's not so much complicity, it's just people's hearts are breaking. And I think what's most dangerous for us is when people stop believing in the Constitution, they stop believing in their state, they stop believing in elections, for example, then you start to create the conditions for anarchy. And once that anarchy begins to set in, then it is very difficult to do the kind of thing that Joshua is talking about, which is, to have a functional human rights-based state that is respectful of the rights of Kenyans. So I think that's the challenge that we've got. For the people of Kiambu, who over the last 2 or 3 months essentially have seen something like about 130 infants and 5 mothers die because of essentially a strike to protest against the lack of drugs or the lack of medicine and the withdrawal of 600 medical interns and the general collapse of our health system. That's tremendous stress on many Kenyans, and I think that's what we have to address very quickly, because I think as the ground begins to feel that these things are normal, that it is, it is okay to essentially storm a police station or to storm a law court, then you are in a different scenario altogether. And we know from our region what that looks like. So it is really important, particularly for the state, to continuously have this sense of duty, this sense of obligation, this sense of human rights. Because every time a state officer breaks those laws, what they do essentially is send a message to everybody that they can break the law. Okay. And that's why I think there cannot be a culture of impunity in this country. That's why police officers must be held accountable. Yeah. And it is shocking. Up to now, we've not seen any police officers arrested for the 6 deaths during the funeral period of Raila Odinga.
Okay, I use that term accomplice, and it's a rather strong term, like you.
It was good. You got me going there.
Because and George, because it's from an author, George Orwell once said this, that people that vote for corrupt politicians are not victims. They are accomplices. Right. So when two of your own are not there, nobody's saying anything. In fact, let me bring up a tweet from one of the senators, Nandi Senator Samson Cherargei, and see what he's saying. If we can push this to this on the side so that we can see it properly and see what he's saying on this. That is Senator Kiprotich Arap Cherargei, that is Cherargei speaking to us. And he said that, I want to urge Kenyans, especially busybody activists, to avoid going to friendly neighboring countries and start to meddle in the internal local politics. This will reduce cross-border abductions and enforced disappearances because other countries have different ways of handling internal dissidents. It isn't like Kenya, where it's free for all. This is so especially as Tanzania and Uganda head for their general elections in the coming days and months. Kenyans should only visit these countries for tourism, education, medical and businesses, etc., while keeping off internal politics and human rights. What is your reaction?
Trevor, can I help Irungu?
Yeah, you can go, Nema.
And you know what Irungu is describing, and even captured in that tweet, is that sadly Kenya and East Africa, actually, let's talk about Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. We're living in a perpetual state of state-sanctioned terrorism. By definition, let me read out for you this definition of terrorism. Terrorism is first and foremost a psychological tactic. Its aim is not to destroy, but rather to induce a general state of fear and collapse, the ultimate purpose of which is the eradication of solidarity, cooperation, and interdependence upon which social cohesion and functioning depend. The hope is that eventually the community will be reduced to pockets of frightened individuals concerned only with their personal safety and thus isolated from their wider social context. That's a 1972 definition by Hutchinson. I'm a scholar when it comes to terrorism. So when you actually look at what Cherargei is describing, is exactly that. Can you just go to Uganda to only attend the association of SME, muungano wa kujisaidia, go to Uganda to look at, the mountains, Rwenzori, but don't you dare think that you have a right to engage politically. It's a very small-minded opinion. It is shameful that a member, an elected member would talk like that. I'm 40, Trevor. I'm 40, and today there's a daily headline that talks about Kenya and sanctions for human rights. I've lived in this country for 40 years without ever imagining that Kenya would ever go through what we've seen with, Zimbabwe, UN sanctions. Can you imagine a world in which we wake up and we who host, one of the largest UN headquarters are actually sanctioned? Do you know the cost of living? So to imagine that young people in 2025 can actually, the state can limit the extent to which they can relate, they can associate, they can even imagine the muungano. Why are you forcing us to sing the East African anthem in every public meeting if you do not want us to associate.
Okay.
And it's also very misguided for a member of parliament to talk like that, because if you read the East African Charter, the apex of integration for the East African community is actually political integration. So the envisioning is that we will have one political, what would you call it? I don't know.
Ideology, so to speak.
Ideology, a unified one. So economic integration is the first and, soft launch. And then you're supposed to integrate socially. And then the idea is that within time, we will actually have one, like the EU, we would have one point of lawmaking, similar policies addressed across board. So why should Kenyans be worried about what's happening in our neighboring countries? Because we can only be as good as the sum total of the least democratic country in that muungano.
Okay. Nyamori, who's violating the EAC Charter here? Is it our people who are meddling, so to speak, in other people's elections, or is it the people who are abducting our people when they're in their country? Who's violating the EAC Charter here?
Sometimes analysis and interpretation of some of these laws and instruments depends on the time and place of the person interpreting it. Definitely, the EAC is charter, and the entire integration is embedded on human rights, rule of law, good governance. And so that is what we are called upon as citizens of the three countries to uphold and to pursue. But then at the same time, it is important to appreciate that the same instruments also call on sovereignty of the states. And, I like being practical when discussing this, that Kenya is far much ahead of the region in terms of the rule of law and human rights, despite the various challenges that we are facing, and that our neighbors are not so good with regard to rule of law and human rights. And it is our responsibility as a country. And Bob Njagi and Nicholas Oyo are my friends. And I hope they will come home. I have worked with them on advocacy for many years. It pains me just like it pains any other Kenyan that, how many days now? 21? 26. They are not back. I'm hoping that our government will continue to work with the community structures and the Ugandan government to trace them and get them home alive and well. But having worked and traveled around these countries, I think it is not far-fetched for us to caution our citizens that it is not safe out there, okay? To promise them that they will be safe in Malakal, in Rumbek, in Gulu, and other parts of the region, when we know that the human rights standards in those countries, that the systems in those countries ain't working as good as ours, even though we also have problems, would be to cheat our citizens and let them walk into, the jaws of lions. I say this because one time I remember I went to Kampala to do an evaluation for a human rights program, for a Swedish funded program. And I had meetings with human rights organizations in Kampala. Then the following day I traveled to Gulu. And when I got to Gulu, I checked into my hotel, then went out to the supermarket. When I came back, I was told that the LC4 wants to meet me. When I was taken to the LC4's office, told me that they had received report from Kampala that I had been in Kampala for 3 days, and that I left Kampala in the morning. They want to know what I'm doing in Gulu. Okay, so I had to avail all the documentation and invite them to the meetings that I was going to. That is what kept me safe. So I would want to look Kenyans straight in the eye and tell Kenyans, it's not safe out there. Most of these countries are basically collapsed states. Okay, we cannot do what we do in the streets of Kisumu, Nairobi, and Mombasa in some of these places. And it's just important that we speak to our people the truth. But even as we call on our government to continue working with the regional structures and the Ugandan government to trace and bring my friends Oyo and Bob Njagi home. That's my view.
Okay. I have to take a quick break. I'll come to you, Rungu. I know I started with you. I'll come to you with you in just a bit. And keep your views coming at Trevor Mbidi at Citizen TV Kenya. Use the hashtag Citizen Monday Report. I'll see you in just a short while. Taking a quick commercial break. We're back with more.
Across Kenya, billions of shillings lie unclaimed, hidden in forgotten bank accounts, insurance policies, and dormant investments. But who ensures this money finds its rightful owners? This Wednesday at 5:30 p.m, Citizen TV brings you a revealing look into how the Unclaimed Financial Assets Authority is holding institutions accountable and protecting your right to reclaim what's yours. Don't miss this eye-opening documentary on Citizen TV.
A painless hard mass on the breast that has irregular edges is more likely to be cancer. However, breast cancers can also present as soft, round, tender, or even painful lumps. Should you notice these signs or any other irregularity with your breast, go for a medical checkup as soon as possible. This message is brought to you by Royal Media Services. We care.
It's big, bigger than you can imagine. It's massive. It's the biggest jackpot. Shabiki Super Jackpot Sahini 100 million. Yes, predict 17 games na 99 bob na ujishikie 100 million. Bonuses ni from 13th correct prediction. Na ukipata zote wrong, usiwori, bado kuna bonus. Hii ndio jackpot. Shabiki Super Jackpot is now at 100 million. To play, download app ya Shabiki on Play Store or SMS SJP to 29063.
Gaming is addictive. Play responsibly. Not for persons under the age of 18. Shabiki.com is authorized and regulated by BCLB. License number BK 0001080.
All right, thank you for staying with the Monday Report. We're still discussing the state of human rights and like to go into the solutions now. But before we get to that, Irungu, you know, nobody's excusing the cavalier attitude in which the government has handled the abduction of Oyo and Njagi. But does a tweet like the one from Senator Cherargei, does he have a point that we shouldn't bury our heads in the sand thinking that our neighbors are necessarily friendly? We've seen this even with the Tanzanian president. She used very strong terms when some of our activists were actually abducted and tortured. She alluded to the fact that we're taking our bad manners to them. Should we continue burying our heads in the sand that our neighbors will necessarily be neighborly as we expect? Or should we just face reality that they're not? and therefore we stay within our borders?
No, I think the case of Boniface Mwangi, Agatha Atuhaire, the case of Bob Jage, the case of Nicholas Oyo are really narratives around a commitment to fight for an East African community in which human rights are protected, where trials are fair trials, that you can't just decide your political opponent needs to be slapped with a treason charge and then lock them up for the duration of an election campaign period. That's what I think some of these Kenyans were trying to argue in the neighborhood, in those neighborhoods. So I think we shouldn't beat around the bush saying that somehow they were naive or that they didn't understand what they were doing. They were actually essentially fighting for an East African community that is consistent with all the things that we hear whenever the East African Legislative Assembly is meeting, in all the documents, the Constitutive Act of the East African Community. These are all, I guess, statements and aspirations of a better regional cooperation than we have currently. That's, I think, what the intention was. Right now, for Senator Cherengei to say that somehow they deserved what happened to them, what happened in Tanzania, what is now happening to Bob and Nick, I think is actually offensive, and I think we should just reject it very quickly. The only thing that I would accept from his statement is his congratulatory comment to those of us who continue to campaign for their release as busybodies. I'm glad that he's seeing the energy. We will continue and we will get louder as long as our people are not protected and as long as our government doesn't protect them as well. So that's the issue. I think there's also a degree of honesty that we must introduce into this process. We somehow seem to forget that leaders like President Kagame spent a lot of time in Uganda. Yeah, they grew up in Uganda. Museveni spent a lot of time in Kenya, right, when he was escaping the horrific violations under Idi Amin and so on. And Salva Kiir, also was based in Kenya for many years. Milton Obote spent time in Tanzania. So to suddenly just pretend like somehow we are different from each other is actually ahistorical and not very helpful. I think what we have always said is that good neighborliness, the perfect neighbor, is the neighbor that provides sanctuary for those that are fleeing persecution, that are fleeing violence from their countries. And Kenya has been that for many years. When the Kenya Kwanza government came to power, with the exception of very limited small number of cases, like, for example, Samson Tekle Michael or Agri and Dong from South Sudan, we had seen very much an attempt to try and protect refugees and asylum seekers in this country. And then we saw the rendition, the refoulement of the Turkish refugees. And then we saw Kizza Besigye. Then we saw 37 forum activists from Kisumu. And now what we're seeing is it seems like everybody can kidnap each other's citizens, and there is no sense of respect for each other's citizens. So I think that's the challenge now, that we have to continue to push for an East African community that actually upholds human rights uniformly, and it doesn't matter whether you're Ugandan, Kenyan, Tanzanian, or Rwandese, or Burundian, or from the DRC. You have the same level of human rights as each other.
And Nema, it is an offensive assertion, but it is a conversation that is being had anyway. That should we just keep this within our borders at a time when political tension is rising with our neighbors because they're facing elections, let's face it. And we've seen countries like Nepal, Madagascar, Indonesia go up in flames because of the rising youthful voices. Is it far-fetched for us to believe that this is the time where we should keep it within our borders?
This is precisely the time you should allow young people or activists or whoever you think are busybodies to explore and to coordinate and cooperate. Because there's no script. No single country can actually say they have it figured out. Trevor, President Barack Obama ran for president twice. He ran for senator. Do you know how many Kenyans went and volunteered in his campaign in the US? What if something happened? Would you say that they had no right to operate there? We've got hundreds, if not thousands, of young Canadians who volunteer for Bernie Sanders campaigns. If you ever want to see change, you've got to allow people to make use of their mobilization capacity, right? So what we're seeing from President Suluhu, from President Museveni, from President Ruto, is manifestation, and their respective administrations, is the manifestation of fear. And this fear is the fear of Gen Z's capacity to mobilize. Honestly, when you see young people mobilizing themselves and showing up for somebody who Shah has failed, or mobilizing and showing up for young Gen Zs who can't afford legal representation, that is frightening to the administrations. But that's not an excuse. And for Senator Cherargei, I'd actually like to read this for him. This is my passport. It's issued by Kenya, but it's an East African passport. The very first sentence of this passport is this: this is to request and require, in the name of the President of the Republic of Kenya, all those whom it may concern, to allow the bearer of this pass freely, without let or hindrance, to afford the bearer such assistance and protection as may be necessary. So the first violation in the abduction of Bob and Nicholas is to the sovereignty of Kenya and to the President of Kenya. That the first, we travel in the name of the President if you're carrying this passport.
So that's
yes.
This passport is not specifically yours. Like, you mean all Kenyans have
yes, yes.
So people watching should actually check their passports.
Please check your passports. If you doubt me, it's not my words.
Nick and Bob traveled with this.
Entered Uganda with a passport that reads this. Yeah. So tell me, what does that mean? Because that's what I want. In fact, the senator, you know, let's give him a little bit of credit. He has valid concerns, but those concerns, we elected him to go to Senate and bring those concerns. We need him to actually table a motion challenging, you know, the security of Kenyans within East Africa. Okay. He can't come to X and start threatening us about, you know, our freedom of movement, yet the same government is giving us a passport that says this. And this is the same thing we'd say to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It doesn't bother you that the sovereignty of Kenya is being challenged by your neighbors? Why are we in a marriage that seems to not, you know, take us seriously? So this is not a matter of just, you know, activists and, you know, Gen Z protesters, or, you know, the people you think want to go to Tanzania to help, you know, protesting, you know, Gen Z. Some things that are being floated on TikTok, but it goes beyond that, even to a business community. To what extent will people then target your business because you're seen to be supporting a regime that is not working for human rights? You know, the same energy that you've seen Kenyans, you know, coming to celebrate Kenya Airways. Imagine if that was actually turned against it, because you are being perceived by the very citizens to be supporting, you know, the opposite side of Kenyan safety. So I think everybody in Kenya should be worried, whether you're in business, whether you're a parent. What are we teaching, you know, these young people who are children who are taking the exams? We teach them social ethics. What are we actually teaching them about what we reward and what we punish? Are we telling them, you know, that they shouldn't care about what's happening in the country? Are we telling them that it's wrong to call out, you know, governance issues when they see something is wrong? What's the point of it?
Okay. It's interesting conversation there. Let's talk about the solutions now, Nyamori. So what do we do from here now? Because we know 2 of our own are still missing. Government of Uganda says it doesn't have them. In fact, now they declare them missing persons. Kenya seems to be silent about it. What do we do now?
Yeah, you see, the challenge in this is that the application of habeas corpus was dismissed. And then the judge actually said that you cannot squeeze blood out of the stone.
Yeah.
And you know, with that, basically what is said is that, I mean, the Ugandan authorities said they don't have the tool. I am hoping that information comes out. I am hoping that they are found. I'm hoping that they are brought home. I am hoping that we are able to improve human rights standards across the region. I am hoping that the region can be stable and safe for all of us to move so that we can trade. But then as we do this, as I said from the beginning, I'm a realist. And in the realism, it is important to ensure that we let Kenyans who travel across the region know of the challenges that they might face in those regions. And then we also need to, broadly discuss these instruments. We cannot cherry pick, certain specific parts of the instruments. For instance, I am a firm believer that we must promote the human rights, the rule of law, the democracy aspects of the East African Community Treaty. But then that treaty also talks about the issue of sovereignty. Yeah. It talks about the issue of respect of internal affairs of various countries. It is important that we have an open discussion to understand what this means, but we do not appear to overreach our rights into, the other states to the extent where, as Kenyans, I remember even on social media, sometimes I remember when we had a clash with our young people had a clash with the Tanzanian president, and they were telling her that we are Kenyans, we are different, we are not like your, because if we do not engage the rest of the countries in a way in which they would appreciate that we also respect their internal affairs. Yeah. Even as we call upon them and campaign and put pressure within the structures that are there, then the only default is for us as Kenyans to say that we are going to war to then make these countries compliant with our systems, which I don't think can work. Okay. We don't have the capacity. Yeah. Tanzania had to take their soldiers to Uganda to kick out Idi Amin. I don't think that we are ready for that, and that is what we are planning to do. I think we still have our internal affairs that we need to deal with, but we need to put our citizens to notice that it is not safe out there. Otherwise, we will be lying to them. Okay.
Irungu, what do we do now? We're in this situation.
So I think the statement by the judge in the habeas corpus was really significant in some ways. I mean, to call the Uganda Defense Forces a stone, and to use the analogy of blood, I think was a kind of a very strong statement. We laugh at it, but actually it's quite a poignant statement from a judiciary in terms of the executive, that the executive is a stone. But perhaps that's the reality that the judiciary has experienced in the context of Uganda. I think we have to keep focused. We have to keep focused on the role of the Kenyan government to use all diplomatic means, all means necessary to essentially determine whether Nick and Bob are still alive, what state they're in, and to ensure that they come home to their families. I mean, it is just heartbreaking to listen to Bob's father, who ironically is a former Makerere student. And for him to talk about what it was like to be in Makerere back in when Makerere was Makerere, and for his son now to be disappeared in a place that he knows very well. So I think that's the first thing. The second one is that if the government is not able to secure the safety of Kenyans and cannot essentially represent citizens, then perhaps we should have a proper travel advisory from the government that says, do not travel to these countries, do not trade with these countries, do not interact with these countries, because they are neither safe for Kenyans to do so. And I think that's what European nations would do, that's what Americans would do. Why are we not having a public advisory if it is true that the government is helpless to protect people overseas? And the third one, I think, is really this issue around the importance of, ensuring that, that Kenyans feel a sense of safety in the region. I think Joshua spoke about the Tanzanian Defense Forces going into Uganda to remove Idi Amin, and it's often forgotten that it actually took 7 years for that intervention to take place. And by the time the Tanzanian Defense Forces removed Idi Amin, somewhere between 400 to 500,000 Ugandans had been butchered and literally slaughtered in a mass exercise of political state orgy. ideology that has left many African countries far behind in terms of just the violence. So I think we have to look carefully at this season of elections, and I think it's not just Uganda we must be worried about. On earlier this week, Amnesty released a report on Tanzania, and the report is called Unopposed, Unchecked and Unjust, and we basically identified 4 areas in which, to be very candid, the electoral environment does not exist in Tanzania for a competitive democratic elections. The only presidential candidate is the incumbent, and it is very likely that she will be elected in circumstances that actually will not give her the legitimacy and the mandate that she was seeking. As we can remember, she actually has not been elected as a president before. This is the first time that she's going to the people of Tanzania to seek their vote. But she has essentially cracked down on journalists, human rights defenders, the opposition. Tundu Lissu's case has been extended just primarily to the other side of the elections to make sure that he cannot run. And you have a whole host of laws that have been introduced to essentially ensure that the freedom of expression, assembly and association just do not prevail in this time. So I think it's really critical that we realize that we are, as a region, what we were most frightened of, which was post-election violence, has now been replaced by pre-election state violence. And that's also important for us as Kenyans, because in 2027, it will be our turn, and we will want to see that we do things differently from what we're seeing in Tanzania and next year in Uganda, perhaps.
All right. Neema, what do you recommend going forward as solutions?
Yes. As a solution, I think our governments should really look at the bottom of what is really ailing the region, right? Like we've just said, today it's Bob and Nicholas. Now, Kenyan journalists are not allowed to cover Tanzanian elections. So once you actually open that door, there's no telling how low we can go. So we have to have this in mind. The anxiety that has been seen in the region has come because of the power of Gen Z. There's no lying about that. But we need to know that this is a global issue, and countries with youthful populations that are relatively well educated and unemployed have a 26% probability of getting into a civil conflict. And this probability moves from 26% to 150% when that demographic is actually is at a youth bulge, or what we call the peak of young people. What's the average age of young people? What's the population size of young people in Kenya today?
70%.
75%. So is there a peak that is, that is actually the definition of what a peak is, right? So when you have 75% of young people who feel disenfranchised, who are educated, who are exposed, whether you like it or not, you will not stop them from using AI. You'll not stop them from reading widely to see Nepal and, and compare notes with Moroccan young people or Madagascar. The answer is never going to be abducting, disappearing a few people. You've got to actually get down into the bottom of what is ailing. I said, I'll tell you what's the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is to actually have that Tanzanian election with the majority of the population feeling like they did not participate. Look at where we are is a direct consequence of, around 15 million Kenyans refusing to participate in the elections in 2022. So whoever wins the election in 2027, it doesn't really matter if you do not actually have that. So looking at the millions in the streets protesting, and then looking at them failing to engage in the IBC process should worry all of us. Because if we get to the other side of 2027 with them still watching and observing, that's a problem. You're going to actually have civil unrest, and I really hate to be the prophet of doom.
Okay, let me bring up the feedback here so that we close on this conversation and see what you're saying online at Trevor Mbija at Citizen TV Kenya. Use the hashtag Citizen Money Report. Orutua says the advances made in democracy in the East African region is at risk of being eroded by the same leaders meant to safeguard it by acting hostile on anybody who tries to question their abuse on the democracy the people must defend strongly. Okay? Gabi says the current Kenyan leaders have become numb to the pains of citizens fighting for accountability. Police brutality, abductions and careless firing is no longer shocking. It's normalized. Behind every cruel and careless behavior is a loss of life. Okelo Mwalimu says human rights activists must change tact in their pursuit of respect for human rights. They should adopt more collaborative approaches when tackling state excesses. Being combative is counterproductive, as it may work against the interest of those in police custody. Okay. Gabi says the current, that is Mark, says our forefathers didn't fight for what we are experiencing in the East Africa community. Something needs to change. Okay. Daniel Kelvin says the UN's concern shows that Kenya's image globally is at stake. We need action, not statements. Okay. Lucy Otieno says, where do you draw the line between freedom of traveling and interference with the democratic processes of that nation? The question should be, do our neighbors respect us enough to not interfere with our issues? Why are we making their issues our business and complain when they rise up to protect themselves? Okay. Kirade says 2 Kenyan citizens, Bob Jagi and Nicholas Oyo, disappeared in Uganda over 3 weeks ago. Both governments have failed to give answers. Uganda cannot claim ignorance when people vanish within its borders, and Kenya cannot sit silent while our sons go missing abroad. Kiare Javan says our human rights activists happen to be very entitled. They need to understand that the sovereignty of a nation lies with the nation and the citizens of that nation. Those ideas of wanting a piece of our neighbors, what is it informed by? In whose interest are we exporting activism? Okay. Titus says listening to the lady in the broadcast is tantamount to comparing day and night. Our East African friends are very different from who we are. The history and the values that define us is a totally different script. Okay? All right, that's where we leave it for now. Thank you so much for making time. You added QR code. What does that QR code, what does it do? So people send in their thoughts on where Bob Jagi, bring them back home.
Absolutely.
Where does it go to?
So it goes to a microsite that allows anybody who scans the QR code to email the Ugandan government to call for Nick and Bob to be released and brought home. So I just urge everybody, before you sleep tonight, please use this QR code and free Bob Jagi, free Nick Oyo.
So it goes straight to the Ugandan government?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you for making time this evening. Thank you for speaking to us. Irungu Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya, Neema Mutemi, Positive Youth Development Expert, and Joshua Nyamori, Advocate of the High Court. And thank you all for the feedback that you sent through. That does it for us for now. On behalf of everyone who made this possible, say good night and God bless.